Building it brick by brick.
Hi everybody, this is Jacquie Luqman. I hope you're having a good Friday. I want to talk to you about something very, very important today that is happening in a population of people in this country that a lot of people don't think about. When we talk about joining in each other's fight, when we talk about having solidarity with oppressed people, very frequently we forget incarcerated Americans in this discussion. And by we, I mean all of us, whether we're Black, white, Latino, Native American, Asian, or progressive, Democrat, Republican, whoever. Most people completely forget about incarcerated Americans in the discussions of and the fight for justice in this system that is really finding ways to oppress us all. But today, I hope we end this habit of ignoring incarcerated Americans in this discussion, because this is a group of people that have been fighting against their own oppression, even as they are, many of them are serving sentences that they should serve for crimes they commit, because they're being treated in ways that are outside of the reasonable punishment for their crimes, and they are having their human and civil rights violated simply because they are incarcerated. So today, if you did not know it, today is the 45th anniversary of the Attica Prison Uprising. If you were a little kid 45 years ago, you probably don't remember this. And I am 48 years old, so I certainly don't remember it. But because I love history, I looked it up. And it was a pivotal point, one of those pivotal points in American revolutionary history, or the history of revolutionary groups in America, for several reasons. But first, I want to address the issue of what the prisoners, the inmates themselves, are bringing to attention, and that is the issue of prison slave labor. Now, as a Black person in America, I'm very careful when and how I use the word slave, because it has a different meaning for different groups of people. It just does. And a lot of people are very hesitant to call prison labor slave labor because they don't believe it has any connection to the disgusting history of the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery in America. But the truth of the matter is, slave labor or prison labor in American prisons today is directly connected to slave labor. It absolutely is, and I am going to show you that connection right now. So stick with me. Hi, everybody who said hi. Hi, y'all. Thank you for joining. So why would we use the term slave labor when we're talking about work that inmates are doing in prison? Let's start with the 13th Amendment, all right? Because the 13th Amendment supposedly outlawed slavery in the United States, right? The 13th Amendment to the Constitution says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, comma, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, comma, shall exist within the United States. That is the actual text from the 13th Amendment to the United States that we've been told abolishes, outlaws, gets rid of slavery. Well, that's not entirely true, because the 13th Amendment itself allowed for the continuation of slavery under the condition of someone being convicted of a crime. So if you are ever wondering why in the United States our prison system is not like other prison systems in the world where people are actually rehabilitated for nonviolent, low-level crimes. If you're ever wondering why we have such a thing as prison labor that is profitable for certain companies and corporations, and if you've ever wondered why it seems like prisoners don't have rights, this clause in the 13th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States explains all of that. Because if you take the clause out, then the 13th Amendment will do exactly what we've been taught it does, abolishes all slavery in this country. You take that clause out and the 13th Amendment would read, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. But that's not what it says. The 13th Amendment also says that slavery or involuntary servitude shouldn't exist, shall not exist in the United States, except when slavery can be instituted against those who have been convicted of a crime. Why does this connect to slavery? Because the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865. We all know that some states didn't comply until years and years later. And as a matter of fact, Mississippi didn't actually ratify, officially agree with, and consent to abide by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution until 2013. That's a very interesting little tidbit of information that I just thought I'd throw in there. You can do with that whatever you choose. So slavery was outlawed by the 13th Amendment in 1865. So all of these former slaves were now supposedly free. If we understand slavery and the fact that it was forced labor that was not paid by slave owners, the slaves were not paid, they didn't get wages. Now you had all these people who were no longer slaves, and we're talking 4 to 7 million African Americans, 4 to 7 million black people who were slaves by law one day. And this happened, by the way, in the South and in the North. If you think slavery didn't exist in the North and in the West and in the Midwest in this country, you are terribly mistaken about the history and the nature of slavery in America. The difference between slavery in the different regions was that the system of plantation slavery existed in the South. That didn't exist so much in the North, but people in the North did own slaves. Okay, so in 1865, 13th Amendment is ratified. Slavery supposedly doesn't exist anymore. You've got 4 to 7 million former slaves. Now they're not slaves anymore. They're not citizens either. They don't have jobs because for 2.5 centuries, they and their ancestors were forced to work for free. So they weren't paid anything. They didn't have labor contracts. They weren't hired to do work. So you had 4 to 7 million people who were basically just let go with nothing, and they were unemployed. They had no homes. Yes, many, they left the plantations, but this is why some chose to stay, because they were so terrified of an unknown world outside of what they knew. And because of the terror campaign that was instilled in them by their plantation owners. If you leave this plantation, you know, we white people really don't like you. So you know, we are going to be set about you to kill you and to harm you. And it's safer for you if you stay here. This happened. So yes, some former slaves chose to stay on their plantations. But of the millions who did not, they were homeless, they were unemployed, and the 13th Amendment just passed in a country that was used to the forced and free labor of an entire group of people for generations. As a matter of fact, this country's economy, especially the economy of the South, was created and grew to be one of the most powerful economies and political forces in the Western world, all on the backs of slaves and free forced labor. So now you have this country that all of a sudden we can't enslave African people anymore. How are we going to continue to feed our industry? I know some people will say, well, immigrant labor was a part of that. Well, yes, that's very true. And immigrants were horribly abused. But see, immigrants were at some point eventually paid. Their labor was paid. They were paid for their labor. They were paid terribly. And they were subjected to horrible conditions, but they were not slaves. Not for 2.5 centuries, they weren't. So what did America do in response to passing the 13th Amendment and basically eliminating an entire workforce? Because remember, this labor was free. Nobody was paying for it. These people didn't get paid for the work they were doing. So nobody was really keen on giving actual legitimate jobs to a bunch of people that they could force to work for nothing for 2.5 centuries. So what did this country do to maintain that system of forced and free labor? We instituted a practice called convict leasing, and that was in conjunction with the creation and passing of so-called vagrancy laws in many states all throughout this country. Vagrancy laws were created basically to criminalize the state of unemployment and homelessness that newly freed black slaves found themselves in order to return them to the system of free and forced labor that built the economy of the South and this country. It was convict leasing that helped build the railroads. Yes, there were Chinese immigrants who were horribly mistreated. There were Irish immigrants who were horribly mistreated. But convict leasing was targeted specifically toward newly freed slaves, African Americans. As evidence of that, between 1865 and 1868, the prison population in this country, all across this country, either tripled or quadrupled or was worse. And over 70% of the people who fed the growth of the prison population in this country during that time were African Americans. Before that time, the prison system was mostly full of immigrants who were committing crime because of the poverty and the lack of opportunity and the discrimination that they were facing. But after the 13th Amendment was passed, after the vagrancy laws were passed, and after the convict leasing system was instituted, the prison population's demographics, the face of the American prisoner, shifted from the immigrant, the young, unemployed, hungry, criminal immigrant, Italian, Pole, Asian, German. The prison population shifted from those people to mostly black people. And it was those people who were leased out to the railroads. And by leased, what we mean in this system of convict leasing was not that the convicts were paid, but that the prisons were paid for their labor. And a lot of times, inmates were leased back to the plantations they just left. If the dates seem familiar to you, they should, because 1865 to 1877, I think it was the period of Reconstruction after the Civil War. How do you think the South got rebuilt? A significant amount of convict lease prison labor that was targeted at newly freed African Americans. rebuilt the South. This is something you're not going to learn in history because the powers that be don't want you to know that slavery never ended in this country. It really just was transformed into something else through the convict lease system, through these vagrancy laws. Oh, what do I mean by vagrancy laws? I didn't explain that well. Like if someone is hanging out on the street during quote unquote work hours when people think they should be at work, they were considered a vagrant and they were arrested. And the punishment, the penalty for being arrested under vagrancy laws was decades of hard labor in prison camps. And most of these prison camps, like I said, were populated by Black people, men and women. Yes, some European immigrants were absolutely caught up in this, but the focus of the convict lease system and the vagrancy laws were African Americans, because we were the free workforce that literally built this country and the economy we can't even benefit from, not generationally today. So fast forward, I hope y'all are keeping up with me because I don't want to keep you for a very, very long time today, but I want you to understand why we need to have solidarity with incarcerated Americans and their fight against not only prison slave labor, but inmate abuse. And then at the end, I'm going to talk to you about Attica and why our criminal justice policies for the past 40 years have been based on a lie that came from that uprising. So let's go from the convict lease system and vagrancy laws and the ramping up of the prison population in the United States among African Americans to 1971 and the Nixon administration and the war on drugs. It can be argued that the war on drugs as it was conceived wasn't racist. I will always say that I don't know that Richard Nixon actually sat down and said, I am going to create a policy through which I am going to be able to incarcerate a whole new 3-4 generations of specifically Black people. I am not going to say that. What I am going to say is that the Nixon administration and those of his advisors who helped him craft the war on drugs knew that that would be the outcome. Because while the war on drugs legitimized, I guess, or legislated mass incarceration and introduced the concept of mandatory minimums, that's where they came from originally, and legislated no-knock warrants for the first time in this country's history. That came from originally the Nixon administration and the implementation of the war on drugs. We know that these policies were not carried out equally, evenly, or even equitably across communities in this country. We know that the war on drugs and mass incarceration disproportionately affected predominantly poor Black and Latino communities, because those are the communities that were targeted. And if we didn't believe that during the 70s, we can certainly see that during the 90s with the passing of the 1994 crime bill. Right? Because, and this is a very current conversation, because the 1994 crime bill, even though it contained legislation that gave harsher penalties for crack cocaine possession and distribution and for methamphetamine possession and distribution, what we know from history and what those of us know who have lived through that period of history is that law enforcement efforts were not evenly, equally, or even equitably targeted to all of the communities affected in this country. What is Jacquie saying? No-knock warrants, jump-out squads, the vice squads, the militarized police presence didn't happen in rural America too much, where there was a lot of meth violence, a lot. Where you had biker gangs that were trafficking in meth and were killing people all over the place, where families were being destroyed by meth addiction, where children were put in harm's way because people were cooking meth in their homes in what was called clandestine drug labs. Yeah, that actually happened, but the militarized police force, the no-knock warrants, the focus of the media on the growing drug problem in America wasn't on white, poor meth users and traffickers. It was on Black and Latino poor people in the inner cities who dealt with crack. And instead of receiving treatment and rehabilitation, the response to people who were dealing with the crack epidemic was brutality, militarized police, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes you're out, mass incarceration, a significant ramping up of mass incarceration. So you have generations of poor Black and Latino people and white people, but disproportionately Black and Latino people, a higher percentage of our population than that of white people's population in this country, in jail, in prison for decades for non-violent drug offenses. Nobody killed anybody. What does this have to do with prison slave labor? Well, because the 13th Amendment allows for slavery in the cases of convicted felons or people who were convicted of a crime, Fair Labor Standard laws, federal minimum wage laws do not apply to inmates. I know you were wondering where I was going with that. That's the connection. This is why inmates who work for large corporations aren't paid minimum wage. There's this misconception that the jobs that inmates have in prison are all sought after and they're all on this waiting list and they're all voluntary and everybody wants to do these jobs, when the truth of the matter is many of the jobs that inmates do in prison is forced labor. You've seen in Arizona that nut job bigot sheriff who has the chain gangs down there. And let me mention, that's not even prison that this Sheriff Joe person is doing. These people haven't even been convicted of a crime. They're in jail. They've been arrested. Many of them are waiting for their trial date. And because of the shaky, weird interpretation of the 13th Amendment, many states say that these people don't have rights because they've been arrested of a crime. They've been arrested for a crime. So because they don't have rights, people don't have a problem with putting people who haven't been convicted of a crime on a chain gang. We shouldn't want chain gangs today anyway because of their history that is rooted in slavery and racism in this country. But we love our punishment in America. We do. We honestly don't believe in rehabilitation in this country. And I know that is true because one of the pieces of legislation that came out of the Clinton administration that we ignore, that we don't know a lot about, that we're not taught about, is the 1996 Prison Litigation Reform Act. Because as much as prison slave labor is a problem where inmates are forced to work at jobs that they don't want to work on, but if they don't work these jobs, they will be punished severely by given demerits against their time, thrown into solitary confinement, or given more time. Then on top of that, they're paid, okay, maybe not slave wages, but they're not paid the federal minimum wage. Because remember, if they've been convicted of a crime, according to the 13th Amendment, they can be subjected to slavery. And slaves don't have rights. Not in America. So, on top of that truth about prison slave labor, and the reason companies like Walmart and Victoria's Secret, I can't even fit anything in there, but you know, when I was smaller I could. But Victoria's Secret and other companies that use prison labor to do things like staff their call centers or sew their garments. Did you know that Victoria's Secret's garments are sewn by inmates? Yes. Yes, most of them are. The reason they use prison labor is because they don't have to pay people a federal minimum wage. So all of the money they are making off of all of the products inmates create for them, it's all profit. It's almost 100% profit for them because they're not having to pay a minimum wage. They're not having to pay benefits. They're not having to pay for health insurance or sick leave. Because again, prisoners don't have rights because they've been convicted. Inmates don't have rights because they've been convicted. And according to the Constitution, they can be subjected to slavery. So on top of all of that truth, there is the 1996 Prison Litigation Reform Act. And here's where we're coming to Attica and why this is important today, as it is the 45th anniversary of the Attica Uprising. The Prison Litigation Reform Act was passed by Bill Clinton in 1996, and it put severe restrictions on the ability for inmates to sue correctional institutions for abuse. That legislation came out of the lies that were told about the uprising at Attica 45 years ago. And we have some articles on our Real Progressives page today about Attica and about this effort that is beginning today in 24 states, in prisons in those 24 states across the country, to renew an organized effort by inmates to fight for their rights. 24 years ago at Attica Prison. So what happened at Attica? 1,300 inmates in Attica Prison organized to fight for human rights and dignity that they were being denied in prison. Yes, many of they were in prison and they needed to serve their time, and absolutely, but they were still human beings, and they were being beaten by guards. They were being served food that wasn't fit for slop for animals. They were denied visits from their family. They were threatened and intimidated by guards and prison administration if they complained about any of it. And if they didn't go along with any of the orders, they were thrown in solitary confinement for decades sometimes. So 1,300 men at Attica Prison got together. And this is another one of those efforts, those multiracial, multicultural efforts, mobilizations of grassroots solidarity across all lines, because there were black inmates, there were white inmates, there were Native Americans, there were Hispanics, and they all got together, 1,300 of them, to fight for human rights and dignity that they were being denied in prison. What was told about Attica was that the inmates took hostages and slit the throats of the hostages. So the governor called in the state troopers, and the state troopers had to come in and rescue the remaining hostages. And that's why 39 inmates were killed. 45 years later, the truth about Attica has finally come out. What actually happened at Attica was that the inmates did take hostages, but they actually did not kill any of the hostages. The accounts of hostages' throats being slit were actually all lies. Not one hostage had their throat slit, not by an inmate. The other lie that came out of Attica was that the inmates attacked state troopers. That is also not true. By the time Governor Rockefeller called the state troopers in, the guards, who again were taken hostage, but none of them were harmed, and the inmates actually made sure that they did not harm the guards. As a matter of fact, the story that's coming out now is that it was specifically Muslim inmates who protected guards. But by the time the Governor Nelson Rockefeller at the time, called in the state troopers into Attica, even the guards who were hostages did not want the state troopers to come in because they knew what would happen. And what they knew would happen did. State troopers apparently took off their badges so they could not be identified. They went into Attica and they physically beat any inmate they came across. They even beat and shot inmates who were in their cells, who were not involved in the uprising at all. And at the end of the day, 39 inmates were murdered by state troopers at Attica. Because of the lies that were told about Attica, legislation like the 1996 Prison Litigation Reform Act was not only passed in this country, but it was enthusiastically supported. Bipartisan support by Republicans and Democrats, pushed by a Democratic administration that wanted to prove that it could be tough on crime. And at different times with different pieces of legislation, didn't have a problem targeting poor Black and Latino people and targeting vulnerable inmates to be the cannon fodder for this tough on crime legislation that took away any kind of chance or hope for rehabilitation, didn't offer any help, and all it did was provide legal retribution for undesirable behavior in this country. So today, on the 45th anniversary of the Attica Uprising, the truth has finally come out about Attica, and thank God for that. But I'm so angry that it took 45 years for us to find out. In one of our articles that we have posted, a few of them are from Democracy Now!, there's a transcript of an interview that is done with an author of a book about the truth that has come out about Attica. I encourage you to watch the video that we post and to read the article and get the book. And I also would encourage you to visit the website of the Incarcerated Workers Organization Committee and ask them, and I'll post the link, but see how you can help support incarcerated Americans today and throughout however long this coordinated, almost nationwide effort goes on of inmates once again fighting for their rights as human beings. See, I want people to understand. I want people to be very, very, very clear on my stance on this issue. It is not that I don't believe that people should be punished for the crimes they commit. It's not that I don't believe people should not pay their debt to society for the times that they actually commit a crime that they need to pay their debts for. Absolutely. If I steal your car, as much as you might like me, I fully expect to go to jail. I fully expect to go to prison. But what I do not expect, what I cannot abide, what I will never ever support, even in a situation where a person is convicted of a crime, is the denial of human rights and dignity to that person simply because they have been deemed a criminal in this society. You don't stop becoming a human being because you've committed a crime. Now, true, there are some people who I believe cannot be rehabilitated. I do believe that, and we can argue and debate that all day, all night, and probably we will never agree on all of the different iterations of that. But I do believe there are some people who cannot be rehabilitated. And I do believe there are some people who should stay in prison for a long time. But even for those people who I believe cannot be rehabilitated because of the crime or the type of crime they have committed, they're still human beings. And as a human being, I can be okay with the denial of human dignity and human rights for the most vulnerable group of people among us, and then turn around and demand that my dignity and my human rights be honored. I can't take human rights from one group of people and demand that mine be honored by everybody else. So regardless of what our position on crime and criminals is, regardless of how we personally feel about specific crimes or specific criminals, it is still true that human beings commit crimes. And it is still true that even as we ensure that people who commit crimes are punished and pay the price they have to pay to society for their crimes, we should do that in a way that rehabilitates them so that they can re-enter society and actually be constructive citizens so that they don't have to return to crime. And that while they are serving their time, we do not treat them in a way that signals that we believe they are less than animals, because we're doing that now. And we must amend the 13th Amendment to remove this clause that allows for the slavery of incarcerated Americans. We keep saying, politicians keep saying, we're better than that. We're a better country than Donald Trump. We're a better country than racists. Our 13th Amendment doesn't say that we are. Our track record with the least among us does not say that we are. I say we stand together with all vulnerable people for their fight for human rights and dignity in this country. I stand in solidarity with incarcerated Americans beginning their strike and work stoppage today, and I stand with them every day that they fight. I hope you do too. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you for watching. Thanks for your comments. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to much of them today because there's so much information that I had. But I will provide you links later.
Building a brick by brick.